The great Supreme Court justices appointed by Franklin Roosevelt were profoundly unlike the justices that we know and love today. They were entirely self-made men, all of them raised in extremely modest circumstances, who were political, opinionated, angry in certain respects. They liked to drink, they liked to argue with each other, and together, through their agreements, and most importantly, through their profound disagreements, they actually created what we think of as our modern interpretation of the Constitution, because four of them, Felix Frankfurter, Hugo Black, Robert Jackson, and William O. Douglas, invented the four leading schools of American constitutional thought. To understand their stories and where they came from and how they lived their lives, you really have to go back to their origins, which were remarkably diverse. Let's start with Felix Frankfurter, who was an immigrant to the United States at the age of 12 from Vienna in Austria. He was not from a distinguished or fancy family. He did have one uncle who was the head of the National Library, and the family liked to brag that they were rabbis in their past. But beyond that, they were very ordinary people, and indeed, when they reached the United States, Frankfurter spoke not a word of English, nor did his father. And his father was an ineffectual, second-hand fur salesman who never managed to make any real money. Frankfurter learned English in the New York City public schools, and then he went to the City College of New York for his undergraduate education, which at the time was a real hotbed of brilliant, ambitious, aggressive young immigrants. And he ended up at Harvard Law School really by accident. One day, he had the money to matriculate at Columbia Law School, but he went out with some friends and they spent all the money because it was a beautiful day. They didn't actually go to the races, although they might as well have done. And as a result, he didn't start at Columbia. Instead, he heard from a friend that Harvard Law School was taking students, and he got on the train and he went to Harvard. If you want to know how poor he was when he came to Harvard Law School, he was so poor that he started Harvard Law School 3 weeks late into the semester so he could collect his full paycheck from the job that he held at the tenement department of the New York City public government. Once at Harvard, Frankfurter, who experienced himself as very short, and he was in fact only 5'4", and surrounded by physical giants of strong New England stock, found that he loved arguing. And he rose through Harvard Law School to become one of its most distinguished students. He was first in his class. Nevertheless, when he graduated, because he was Jewish, no major law firm in New York City would hire him. And he had to wait for one of his professors to call the firm and insist that they take this young man. They tried to make Frankfurter change his name because it sounded like a hot dog, and they told him that was funny. And he said that he thought he'd do very well, thank you very much, with the name that he had gotten at birth. And he stuck with it. The next of these extraordinary justices grew up very, very far from Frankfurter, but in genuine poverty as well. This was William O. Douglas, who was born to a father who was a minister, who died when he was an extremely small boy. And he grew up in Washington State in genuine poverty in a single-parent family headed by his mother. When he managed to get into college, he was so poor that he had to hold 4 jobs to put himself through. He swept out a hash house, that's what they called cheap, lousy restaurants, in order to make enough money to support himself to get through college. He wanted to be a Rhodes Scholar, but he didn't become a Rhodes Scholar, and he attributed that to the fact that he had not had enough money to go to the University of Washington, which typically got a Rhodes Scholar. But Douglas had a confidence that was extraordinary relative to his modest circumstances. How did you get from Washington State to New York City if you were an impoverished young man in the 1920s? The answer is you would hitch a ride on a freight train and you would need to eat. So what Douglas did is that he got a job as a shepherd tending sheep that were being brought across the country on the train to be slaughtered in Chicago. And that paid his way all the way to Chicago. And then he rode the rails from Chicago into New York and arrived in New York with 10 cents in his pocket. He walked in to a fraternity, and there was a local chapter of the same fraternity he had belonged to at University in Washington State. And so he showed up and said, "Hi, I'm a brother of the fraternity." And they said, "Okay, we'll give you a bed." And he then got tutoring jobs and worked his way through Columbia Law School, entering the mainstream and the leading edge of American society simply by virtue of his guts. If Frankfurter came all the way from Europe, and if Douglass came from Washington State, the South has yet to be mentioned, and that's where Hugo Black was from, specifically rural Alabama, Clay County, Alabama. His father owned a hardware store, which made them modestly prosperous in what was basically a very poor town. And if you look at the picture of the family with Hugo Black as a tiny boy, things are so rural and so basic that the pickets on the fence in front of the house are not even whitewashed like Tom Sawyer, and they couldn't have been easily whitewashed because they're hand-hewn pickets. So even though this is the late 19th century in the United States, they were living as though it were 300 years earlier. Black had a fiery temper and a deep sense of his own honor and pride, like a good Southern gentleman from an early age. He went to a one-room schoolhouse, and one day his younger sister was disciplined by the schoolmaster, who threatened to whip her. Black did not think any man should lay hands on his sister, so he, in turn, whipped the schoolmaster. This led to his being expelled from school, and since there were no other schools in the vicinity, that was the end of formal high school for Hugo Black. He stayed at home, read on his own, and tried to become educated, and then, after 2 years, he signed up to attend the medical school at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. He went to Birmingham, lasted a year, and flunked out, because it turned out that you couldn't actually give yourself a good pre-med education on your own with a few books. He went home a failure and convinced his parents that perhaps they should let him try a second time, and this time they sent him off to the University of Alabama Law School, which was just a small subpart of the college, really, with a handful of students. And the legal education was not what you would call a great national legal education. He was lucky to learn anything, really, under those circumstances. Black graduated and set up shop as a small-time lawyer on his own. The first real job he got was as a judge in what they called a local criminal court. It was misdemeanors, and it was mostly people who were drunk, who were being brought in on drunk and disorderly charges. He hammed it up and became the favorite of a local newspaper reporter who was looking for human interest stories. And that gave him a statewide reputation as a clever young fellow. But there was no money in being a judge in one of these courts, and so after a year, Black went off to the big city in Birmingham and decided to start again on his own and become a lawyer. He began his career promisingly, gaining clients, and he joined dozens and dozens of civic organizations, all in the hopes of winning clients. He also entered into the social life of the time, courting and eventually marrying a very beautiful girl called Josephine Foster, who remarkably moved in the same social circles as Zelda Fitzgerald. And if Hugo Black was not quite as poor as Jay Gatsby had been, and if Josephine wasn't perhaps quite as rich as Daisy, nevertheless, it was very much analogous to the Great Gatsby's rise. That's where Black was. Last but not least of the four was Robert Jackson. Jackson came from the country, but the country was upstate New York, which at the time was still profoundly rural. And his hometown was Jamestown, New York, a place that gradually grew industrially over the course of the 20th century, but that when he was a child was really extraordinarily basic. No one in his immediate family had gone to college, but he had an uncle who was a lawyer. And the uncle convinced him that he might want to hang out around his office and get some training and eventually go to law school. He went to law school for a single year and then spent the rest of his time as an apprentice in his uncle's legal office. And in those days, you could still become a member of the bar by doing things that way. Perhaps most interestingly, the uncle was also involved in politics. And through him, Robert Jackson, at age 19, got to travel to Washington, D.C., where he met a New Yorker, and that person, fatefully enough, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.